Hey guys, welcome back. So now with getting into King in Black Part 2, there's a few things I want to get into with this one, because aside from issue 2, there's a bit of tie-in information that I want to kind of squeeze into this one as well, and kind of shed some light on how this is affecting other places in the world while we're zoomed in on the main event. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch us spills every week, and don't forget to hit that bell up top so you can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping into part 2, I'm going to be pulling some stuff from like all over the place just to paint a bit of a picture of what's happening in relation to some of the tie-ins. Because where we had last left off with Knull stripping the Venom symbiote off of Eddie Brock, we also had the case to where the effects of this invasion leaving their mark all across the world. And this we knew mainly from what we had seen in part 1, with Knull's symbiotes covering the entire planet, and it's in that case with some of the tie-ins to where we take a bit of a closer look on how some of that chaos unfolded in different areas around the world, to where you might have guessed it didn't go too well for anybody else either. And part of that we see in the Union issue 1, which takes place in Great Britain, and in their case it started off with this live broadcast of how they're putting this new team together, but then it quickly went left when a symbiote dragon just swooped through and started tearing these people apart. And I mean, like, okay, well, let me tone that back. Like, everybody didn't get torn apart, because when the dragon showed up, Britannia, she did leap into action before anyone else, charging for the dragon and taking its head clean off, which we know is not going to finish that thing. But with doing so, she was also impaled in the process, which sucked, because right after that, the remains then went on to a couple of soldiers who already didn't like this new team, because aside from Union Jack, they're already making fun of a lot of the new members and saying how those guys weren't necessarily British hero material. But then aside from this, you also have a bit of what's been going on with Atlantis attacks, because over there you have Mike Wen, who had constructed the city of Pan, which in itself is like a city that is made of slices of other cities like Tokyo, Hong Kong, Madripoor, and many others. But to power this city, he had stole a dragon from Atlantis, which didn't play out well when Namor came back asking for it. But after that whole thing had played out, Mike Wen had then taken interest in symbiote dragons, which has now taken him into another direction moving forward. And it's pretty interesting because it kind of leans into the Shang-Chi history, to where thousands of years ago, dragons were like these wise advisors, and the humans were more like their avatars. And with them referencing it now, I kind of want to see how they tie it with symbiotes. But that just gives us a bit of a glimpse at what's been going on around the world during the time of the chaos of King in Black issue 1. But then after this, then jumping over to Venom issue 31, which I almost feel like it could have been the same issue as King in Black Part 2, mainly because the way that the two read so seamlessly, but instead it's delivered as a tie-in, and when I read it, I was like, I'm definitely gonna put that in Part 2 in the same video. But even still, I think it was pretty sick how the title was called 32 Seconds, with everything that took place within that issue happening within that short window of time, because it's here when we see when Knull had stripped Eddie from the Venom symbiote and tossed him off the building, where he absorbs the symbiote into himself, to where we get that painful departure between Eddie and the Venom symbiote. But I also feel like there's quite a bit going on here, with the 32-second theme having a number of things happening at the same time. Because not long after, when we jump over to Dylan, we see a bit of that, because in the case of Dylan, who like we had seen was locked away in Ezekiel's safe room, which at this point still has like a day 1 PS4 sitting over in the corner, which kind of shows the age of this room a little bit. But while he's here, he gets his hands on a radio and he tries to see like what's going on out there, and mainly because the TV that he's watching, like the signal's lagging, the picture's going out, and for that reason he's trying to make verbal contact with someone to see what's going on. And he gets Tony Stark for a second, but he just dismisses Dylan with the quickness by more or less telling Dylan let the grown people handle this and to get off the radio and keep the line free. But with Dylan being locked down here and having the television go in and out, it really just leaves Dylan to find some other type of method to reach out and either get in contact with Eddie or just find out what's going on. And so the next thing he does, he uses his powers to reach out to Eddie and the Venom symbiote, and when he does, a couple things happen here at the same time. Because one, the symbiote tells him to hurry up and disconnect, and it pushes him out, because this is happening at the very moment that Knull is stripping the symbiote off of Eddie. And as soon as Dylan is pushed out by the Venom symbiote, the television has a moment of clarity to where he actually sees the moment on the news when the two were separated and Eddie was dropped from the rooftop. And it really makes you think like, man, there's gotta be a few things running through Dylan's mind. And it could be like, one, this cameraman was fire, because to catch an angle like that in the middle of all this chaos, like, you showing some talent right now. But then secondly, I imagine he's thinking of Tony Stark and just thinking like, man, that guy's such a liar. Talking about they got this. Because from that image alone, Dylan can tell that things aren't looking good for his dad, let alone anyone else. But aside from Dylan seeing that brief clip of what's going on, after Eddie was dropped, there was a moment where he had said like this quick prayer, because in this moment he's dropping, he ain't got no symbiote, so in his mind he's like, it's a wrap. dear God. But in this moment, it's very unselfish where Eddie just says a prayer for Dylan, that he turns out to be safe, and that he doesn't eventually pay for the sins of his father. But also, like, with first seeing this happen, like, I had one of these moments to where, like, you know, like when your logical brain tries to figure out stuff in the comic book? But yeah, like, that's what happened, and I had one of these moments, like, right here. Because as Eddie is falling, and he sees this chopper, like, trying to get away from one of these symbiote dragons, and I'm thinking initially, like, is that military, or is that the chopper with the cameraman who deserves an award? But either way, when Eddie sees the chopper, he tells them to land because they're not gonna outfly that dragon. And Eddie was right, because the dragon clipped the chopper, which then immediately caused it to explode. But this is the part when logical brains started thinking a little bit like, okay, so like when the chopper exploded, it kind of looked like the explosion slowed down Eddie's fall. Or at least that's what I picked up as the story that's being given, with him being knocked off of his trajectory into an alley to where he physically did an integrity check on every fire escape on the way down, hitting all kind of rails and breaking bones left and right. Like, this in itself was just painful to watch, only for him to land on top of this car to where it's like, dude, your skeletal integrity has to be like the equivalent to like cereal crumbs right now. Like, he needs some milk. But it's right after this where he's found by Peter and Eddie is barely hanging on. And it's like, this is one of those moments that really reminds you of how far the two of these guys have come, which I also feel like was one of the undertones from Venom Island, which heavily referenced Once Upon a Time when Eddie had tried to kill Peter. But then towards the conclusion, when Eddie started telling the heroes about the coming of Knull, you had a moment when Eddie directly addressed who he was then and who he is now. Because on top of that, along the way, the change in Eddie has also changed the dynamic between him and Peter. And when Peter gets here, recognizing that he wasn't there in time to catch Eddie, it just breaks his heart. And without knowing what to do from here, he just cries out for help. But in the case of Knull, who had been standing there like this whole time watching, from King in Black Part 1 through Venom issue 31, all the way to this point in King in Black issue 2. Like, he really wanted to see if Eddie was gonna stick that landing. But really, like, when this happens, Knull has a bit of a moment. Cause for a second, he's like, honestly, how hard is it to kill one man? And if you think about it, this isn't the first time Knull has tried to kill Eddie, especially if you count all the times throughout Venom Volume 4 when Knull initially was doing the whole Avatar symbiote thing. So it's like now Knull has a bit of a moment like, look, I'm getting frustrated. But then it's here where Peter's spider sense goes off and he ducks just in time to dodge an optic blast which grazes his back, and it's here where Peter finds out that the heroes who were taken under, that rather than them being killed, that they were instead made a part of Knull's army. But with Peter being cornered here with Eddie, like, he's then saved by the arrival of Johnny Storm, to whom in any other symbiote event, like prior to Knull, Johnny Storm would have been the end all be all. Because in any other situation, he could have just flown around, burning symbiotes left and right, with fire being one of their longtime weaknesses. But later on we had found out that that was more so a byproduct of a disconnection from Knull, which had started when he was initially placed in the symbiote prison. But with him breaking out and reconnecting a number of them to his hive, that weakness has been nerfed because now the symbiotes have a direct connection to the source. But when Johnny gets here, he pretty much tells Peter that he's going to use his Nova Blast to give Peter a chance to get Eddie to the Fantastic Four lab. But even though Peter tells him, and Johnny, like, he knows, like, after he uses his Nova Blast, his energy is spent, and after that the symbiotes will just get him too. But he does this anyway in order to get Peter and Eddie out of there, and in return he's like, man, just tell him I said something really heroic. But with him doing this, which is effectively like the impact of a small exploding star, it effectively gave Peter the chance to get out of there and take Eddie over to the Fantastic Four lab. But while Reed is doing what he can to help Eddie, we also see Jane Foster, Valkyrie here, which is a role we'd seen her step into towards the conclusion of War of Realms. But because of her role as a Valkyrie, who are like your demigoddesses who would take your fallen warriors to the gates of Valhalla, but aside from just as guardians, there were times where they would tend to humans in wars as well. But because of that role, she can also see when someone's near to death, and in the case of Eddie, she more or less lets Peter know, like, she doesn't know necessarily how to save Eddie, but she lets him know, like, she has a pretty good idea of how close to death Eddie is, and man, like, if they were any closer right now, they'd be kissing. But then after this, we jump over to Dylan, who's inside the safe room playing on the PS4, and there's no harm in that. I still got a PS4 Pro, no PS5 yet over here. Like, I gave up that hunt a few weeks ago, but I digress. But either way, because when we jump over to Dylan and Peter walks in here, it's tough for Peter to even get the words out, let alone look at Dylan out of guilt just because he couldn't prevent what had happened to his father. But even still, like, in this moment, like, props to Dylan for hanging in there tough even after what he had seen, and even now in this moment being aware of the condition that his father's in. But so when Peter and Dylan walk into the lab area with everyone else, like, you got everybody else in the room, and Alright, so you got Valkyrie, you got T'Challa, you got Sue Storm, Reed Richards, and there's no awkwardness there, which I promise is something I'll get back to in just a little bit. But on their end, T'Challa asks Jane like, where's Thor? But as far as she's aware at this time, there's no sign of him. But then on the other hand, you have Blade, who's on a virtual call with Xavier and Magneto, and he's trying to get them to open the gates of Krakoa so that the people who haven't been taken by a symbiote, they can both go there for refuge and also deny Knull from taking more bodies. But when this happens, they refuse to give the world access to their gates, and when they do this, I really don't blame them because they've seen the consequences of acting loosely with letting just anyone onto their island, let alone the mass numbers that Blade is talking about. And in their case, with being in this last-ditch effort for stopping the extinction of their kind, they can't risk Knull or anyone else who pops in who will want to wipe them out and botch any of the plans that they have to secure their survival. But then it's also here where Peter asks like, what's the update on Eddie? Like, how's he making out? Is he getting any better? But at this point, Reed lets him know like there's no change in Eddie's condition, but they're still working on it. But on top of that, like with still dealing with this huge invasion, T'Challa chimes in, letting them know that against Knull, they have the full support of Wakanda and other forces. But on top of that, like, hey, can we get some of those Infinity Stones or the Ultimate Nullifier or the Cosmic Cube? Which Blade kind of feels like is a bit much for just one guy. And Jane Foster's just like, yeah, we're definitely gonna use everything we got. And she's absolutely right, because this quote unquote one guy, he's the same dude that tore the Sentry in half just a few minutes ago. And it really feels like in this moment that Blade got a bit of short-term memory, because they also seen the Celestials, who Knull had also defeated, and then later subjugated into a symbiote army. And everybody here saw that, like during the invasion, you couldn't miss it. And on top of that, he's been this tough for billions of years. And off of that alone, like any suggestion for a cosmic sized solution, it is merited in this situation. But it's here also where Namor arrives, and he hears like King of the Abyss, and he's like, yeah, that's cute, or that's adorable. And it sounds exactly how Namor would make an entrance at this moment. But also when he gets here, like here's the thing I was talking about. Because when he arrives and Reed is kind of like side-eyeing Sue, like, did you call him to come here? Which is kind of a reference to the history between Namor and Sue Richards, because she kind of does have a history of stepping out on Mr. Fantastic. But I love that we see a bit of this, because usually things like this are just brushed over or looked over when you have like these huge team ups with everybody. But it's like also the thing that's not mentioned here is like the history between Sue and T'Challa, which is one of those things to where, like, if you guys remember, or for you guys that's been rocking with me for a minute, I did a video on that particular fling like a long time ago, and I got a link down in the description for anybody who's fairly new who would like to go check it out, or for anybody who just wants to take a trip back down memory lane. But I like this moment because it reminds me of something my homeboy Rodney always says. Because he's like, if you keep enough skeletons in your closet, sooner or later a bone gonna fall out your mouth. And that really just describes Sue Richards' situation in this moment. But when Namor arrives, he really takes the room and he makes a few really valid points. And it really just crushes everybody's skepticism of him being here. Because Namor and his people, they've been fighting in the freezing dark for millions of years. These guys just started at it and they suck. And on top of that, if you want to talk about like whose world this is and who should be making any decisions, oceans and the water cover over 70% of the world. And with that being the case alone, if anybody should be here talking about what should be done to save the world, then it should be the king of the seas himself. And so after Namor is through with just validating the reasons why he should be here, he then asks if they have any suggestions or some type of a plan, and immediately Tony steps up. He's like, I do, and it might sound crazy, but I need a dragon. And I gotta tell you, I couldn't have been in the room because I would have been like, what kind of fam foolishness is this? But at the same time, this is Tony Stark, and if anyone is going to take every factor that is available and think their way through and around a number of solutions, then it's gonna be him. And in this moment, he puts together the need for Eddie Brock to be saved and the threat of Knull, and he's like, look, I need one of the symbiote dragons because the symbiote's the only thing that's gonna keep Eddie alive. And as far as finding a way to stop Knull, Tony then tells them that they need Eddie alive because Eddie's the only person that he's aware of who can get close enough to Knull to shut him down. And with doing this, Tony has his methods on how he's going to get this symbiote dragon, but then also he makes a suggestion for some of the others as well, to where in the case of Namor, he sends him down to the Marina Trench to release the Black Tide, who are cursed and imprisoned by the Atlanteans, and knowing that after getting their help, it's going to be a whole nother thing trying to get them back within some type of containment or imprisonment. But even still, these guys are way tougher than anyone who Namor really has to ally with him, and that's exactly why they're needed right now, regardless of what they've done and why they've been locked away there. And as far as like how how to get them back in there after all this is said and done. It's more like a we'll cross that bridge when we get to it type of situation, or swim under that bridge, you know, whatever they say in the ocean these days. But really that's the case everywhere else in the world, because Blade, he's sent to recruit Dracula, and Tony's also like somebody to get on the horn with Mayor Wilson Fisk so he can pull together who he needs to, because like we all know, if there's anything that can bring the world together, it's an alien invasion. But from here, jumping back over to Tony, who's taking care of step one, priority one, which is getting Eddie Brock a symbiote and getting him back in the fight. And when he does this, we get a bit more of the detail of Tony's plan of getting this dragon symbiote, to where step one is breaking his connection with the Hive. And to do this, he has to break down the dragon symbiote's DNA and rebuild it simultaneously. And because of that, he uses Extremis. And when I first seen this, I was thinking like, wow, that's perfect. But then I thought about it, and just thinking about like how this worked out with the Hulk and the whole Doc Green situation, it then kind of made me think like, okay, there's a number of ways that this could go wrong. But either way, Tony's able to pull it off and bring the symbiote back to the lab. But even with carrying it back, Tony's dealing with all kind of crazy sensory overload, with the symbiote feeding him the screams of millions of people in pain. But he gets to the lab and he's like, oh well, I'm still gonna give it to Eddie. And what do you know, the symbiote tries to kill Eddie. But when this happens, Eddie's vitals start spiking, and immediately Reed just tries to rip the symbiote right back off. And for Dylan, he's trying to ask everyone to move and get back, but no one's really listening to him because he's a kid. And it just comes to the point where he's like, I said move! And he does his Dr. Manhattan on the symbiotes thing that he does. But when this happens, like for a lot of them, this is their first time realizing what Dylan can do. And with seeing this, Reed then goes on this rant of how Dylan can be their secret weapon. And when Reed does this, I start thinking of a few alternate Reed Richards who would have reacted this way in this moment. Because when Reed talks about Dylan being their secret weapon, though it's a good plan, it also just feels like Reed is a bit too excited. Like, yes, Dylan, you are incredible, you have powers. And I'm just looking in the corner of my eye like, alright Reed, calm down. But then on top of this, they start to hear this noise kind of underlining through all the commotion, only to quickly discover that Eddie Brock has flatlined. And man, like really, like from this point, there's no telling like how this will affect Dylan, because this could traumatically push him in any direction. But even still, I kind of got my fingers crossed that he'll remember the words of his mother from Venom Beyond, or that Earth's version of his mother, who had told him just before he left and came back here to remember her voice anytime he feels like he's being pulled into that darkness. Because we've seen before this like where villain Dylan could go, and I'm really hoping for this Dylan to go in the good guy direction. And so now real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the Patreons. Thank you guys for all your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below to where you can head to patreon.com/dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.